back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and we are covering the events in Gaza and in Israel as well. Joining us now is Hagai Elad. Hagai is the executive director of B'Tselem, which is a human rights organization based in Jerusalem. They have done very important work on the subject of Palestinian rights in Israel as well as Palestine, and he joins us now. So first of all, Hagai Elad, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Secondly, I want to start with this before we get to the current crisis and violence in Gaza. Your organization published a report in January, and you are a human rights organization, defining the situation for Palestinians within Israel and the occupied territories as apartheid. I think that declaration on your part had an enormous worldwide impact. And then in April of this year, Human Rights Watch reached the same conclusion. Just briefly, on what basis did you reach that conclusion?
Yeah, and thank you for providing the opportunity to discuss that context before we zoom in towards Gaza, because I think that's really important to understand the events of the last week and a half in the context of that broader reality. B'Tselem itself, we've been founded back in 1989, so this is already just over 3 decades of work. And ever since the founding of the organization, we've exclusively focused only on human rights violations in the occupied Palestinian territories, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. Obviously, reality has evolved or rather deteriorated over the years. Things have changed. We are not where we were 3 decades ago or before that. And you can see that the language that the organization has been using to describe the injustice that we are facing has also evolved over the years. Initially, we would talk about an occupation, and then about a prolonged occupation, and then more recently about a one-state reality. But we have come to the understanding that all these have not been sufficient, and for us to do a fair analysis of the regime that we are trying to address, we need to do an analysis of the entire area under that regime's control. Obviously, that's a major departure from the framework that we've been thinking through until that point, but we came to the conclusion that that departure is essential. And this comes in the face of a worldview that tries to continue pretending that the reality here exists of 2 parallel regimes that are somehow separated on the green line, that there's a democracy inside the green line, inside Israel proper, and that independently of it, somehow attached to it, there's a temporary occupation project. So democracy plus occupation, if you will. That worldview has become completely untethered from reality. You really need to close your eyes to a broad array of major facts to continue to hold on to that perspective. You need to ignore the passage of time. It's more than 5 decades of this reality, which is the majority of the time in which the state of Israel itself has existed, right? You need to ignore the fact that there are more than 600,000 Jewish settlers living on the other side of the Green Line in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, but the state provides them rights and protections as if they live inside Israel proper, no difference. You need to ignore the fact that part of the occupied territory has been formally annexed, East Jerusalem, and that the rest of it has been de facto annexed. You need to ignore the fact that the policies implemented by the Israeli army are not set independently by some rouge military commander, but they are in service of the civilian policy dictated by the government in Jerusalem. But all this or still omits the key aspect that you need to skip over if you want to continue holding on to democracy plus occupation, which is to ignore the fact that there is a single organizing principle that is in effect everywhere under Israel's control between the river and the sea. And that is the principle of advancing Jewish domination and supremacy over Palestinians everywhere under Israel's control. And it also needs to be spelled out that this is happening in a reality of demographic parity. There are approximately 14 million people that live between the river and the sea, half of them Jews like myself, half of them Palestinian. And yet what we have here is everything but parity in political rights, in protections, in the way the state addresses the human beings it controls. So that is the context of that analysis. And that is textbook apartheid, a regime that works towards that goal and to preserve and advance it, that is apartheid.
In a sense, what you describe is, that there's been, or my interpretation is that there has been a kind of polite fiction of democracy plus occupation that has not, for the Israeli government, certainly been even a reality that it believes, because it has in fact acted as if it believes in a one state that is Israeli controlled and Israeli dominated and is, as you say, apartheid driven. And that in fact, if you look at the maps of settlements, of the expansion of settlements, that you don't see anything resembling two states already. So that's how it seems to me. And so it seems to me that the only people who might have been believing this kind of dual imagery of a democracy that has occupied some other places are, for example, people in the United States or elsewhere, that in fact, on some level, this must be accepted reality for everyone, Israeli or Palestinian, in the area. Is that reasonable to you? Is that a fair interpretation?
I think it's a convenient lie for many. Obviously, it's not a convenient lie for the people on the receiving end of this reality. And I think it's important to highlight the fact that Palestinian scholars and activists and human rights organizations have been making this point already for quite some time, well before we've made the determination that this is apartheid. Why am I saying that this is a convenient lie? It's a convenient lie for Jewish Israelis because apartheid is an inconvenient truth to admit. So as long as one pretends that the problem isn't here, but the problem is there in the occupied territories and not with the regime itself, that the problem isn't structural, and that the problem is, maybe at some point in the future, right? Then you can wake up in the morning and go on with your life and not really think about the underlying root causes that need to be addressed. So that's in the domestic context why this is convenient. Internationally, I think we've seen the level of convenience that this fallacy actually serves through what has played out over much of 2020, after, at the time, President Trump launched his quote-unquote peace plan, and the discussion about formal annexation of additional chunks of the occupied West Bank. And if you listen carefully to what the international community that was trying to convince Israel, besides the US, not to go ahead with this step, what were they actually saying? They weren't saying, we demand freedom for Palestinians, we demand an end for this injustice. What they were saying is, don't formalize it. That's it. We just want things to continue the way they were until 5 minutes ago. So as long as you don't call it by its proper name, as long as you're not formalizing it, we're actually totally fine with perpetual oppression of Palestinians by Israel without giving them political rights with impunity, which is the recipe that has made this so convenient for Israel for such a long time. And that is, I think it's deeply, besides being deeply outrageous, I think it's really helpful in exposing the hypocrisy of the international community in this context, because as long as Israel doesn't make it formal, it just provides sufficient deniability for international stakeholders to continue paying the lip service to the two-state solution and sometimes issuing, another statement of expression of concern and what have you, but without actually taking anything that's close to the really needed steps to address what is happening here.
Again, we're talking with Hagai Elad, who's executive director of B'Tselem in Israel. Hagai, it seems to me, and of course, apartheid, the meaning is literally apartness, right? I mean, we're talking about a system that holds one group of people, one or more groups of people, apart and inferior from those who control the system. So one of the parallels, it seems to me, with South Africa, for example, where the term originated, is African National Congress, for example, began as a nonviolent organization. Now, I believe in nonviolence. I'm sure you do too. And many people in the West have said, well, why don't the Palestinians just protest nonviolently? But part of what we've seen is that Palestinians protesting nonviolently have been shot, if I'm not mistaken, at the fence, at the border fence, and elsewhere. So it seems to me that another characteristic that the parallels, for example, the original apartheid of South Africa, is this escalation, this refusal to countenance even nonviolent protest against the system as it exists. What do you think of that observation?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe let me just say that I'm sure that a lot of the people that hear the word apartheid, immediately they're thinking about South Africa, as you've mentioned. And we also relate to that in the position paper that we published back in January. But it's also important to understand that in the decades that have passed since apartheid South Africa, apartheid has become an independent political and legal concept, right? Mm-hmm. And for something to count as apartheid, it doesn't need to be an identical replication of the reality that existed in South Africa during those years, which also I would say, I think such a requirement would have been ludicrous because history never repeats itself in an identical fashion. And if you just find a few minor differences and then you start shouting from the Israeli propaganda perspective, oh, but what about this? What about that? It's not the same. How dare you call it apartheid? Well, it doesn't need to be the same. We're not saying it is the same. What we are saying is that the essential aspect of it, group domination over another subjugated group, that is what is at play here. And that qualifies also to the independent of history definition of apartheid. And there are some key differences, including the fact that apartheid South Africa self-announced itself as such. Mm-hmm. Israel is very careful not to do that, and in fact insists on marketing itself as a democracy. And also there are other differences, and if we have time, maybe we can touch on some of them. But directly to your question, I think you're aiming at the structural violence that is inherent to what is happening. And I think that also might bring us closer to the situation in Gaza these days. Because it's like the distinction between visible and invisible violence, or hot and cold violence, right? Because I think like international attention, maybe naturally, is there when there is visible violence, when there's rockets and bombings, as is happening. And yes, we need to pay attention when that is happening. But let's assume that there is indeed a ceasefire, and I hope it will happen as soon as possible, so that the carnage will stop. But does that mean that the violence has ended? No, that doesn't mean that. It only means that we're back to the invisible violence, because the daily existence of Palestinians under Israel's regime, they're always subject to one form or another of state violence, because of the oppression, because of the permit regime, because of the limitations on freedom of movement, because of the 14 years plus blockade on the Gaza Strip, because Palestinians can be killed with impunity by Israeli security forces, because of the exposure to settler violence, which is backed by the state, and so on and so forth. And all these things have become so routine and so normalized that they basically have become invisible. And somehow the perception internationally and by the Jewish majority inside, Israel proper, is that Palestinians are just supposed to accept that, without any form of resistance. And any form of resistance is immediately equated with terrorism, right? If Palestinians try to go to the UN, it's called diplomatic terrorism. And if they call for sanctions, it's called economical terrorism. And if they go to the ICC, it's called legal terrorism. And if they try to demonstrate, it's called popular terrorism. So basically anything a Palestinian does besides waking up in the morning and saying, thank you, Israel, for oppressing me and taking my people's lands, that counts from Israel's perspective as terrorism.
And I think we can see another example, a graphic example of that structural violence in the rates of COVID infection among Palestinian populations, right? I mean, I think the ongoing difficulty accessing medical care, medications, and so on, these are all forms of violence. And maybe this is a good time to segue to the events leading up to what's going on now, because I think that got very little attention in the Western press. And of course, it's critical, I think, to understanding what's happening now, which including Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood in Jerusalem where Palestinian families were being turned out of their homes. And for example, the New York Times reported on that by saying, well, the Israeli courts ruled they had no right to be there, but the New York Times didn't address the question of why the Israeli courts had jurisdiction in the first place, given the original UN division of Jerusalem and so on. So we had that. We had the Al-Aqsa Mosque situation, a site that is one of the three holiest in Islam, being invaded by the military and people there being attacked and so on violently. So we didn't hear too much about those things. Maybe you can help us set the context for what led up to the current violence.
I think especially in the context of the example that you brought up specifically of what is unfolding in Sheikh Jarrah, the Palestinian neighborhood in occupied and illegally annexed East Jerusalem, is very telling, because that guise of legality that it's been sanctioned by Israeli courts is an often used refrain by Israel to justify what it does to Palestinians. And that guise of legality is one of the main mechanisms used by Israel to push against international intervention and to push against accountability. And if we take a step back and just ask ourselves, when was the last time in which Israel was held accountable to any of its human rights violations against Palestinians? And answer that painful question to yourself, you see how we have arrived here, right? Like impunity is what has paved where we have arrived, because impunity is what spells out that this is, I'll put it this way, Israel's project of oppression and dispossession of Palestinians stands on two legs. One leg is the ability to advance this project at the expense of Palestinians, but the other leg is the ability to get away with it with no consequences. That is essential to maintain the backing of much of the public, of the Jewish public in Israel, that is not interested in paying a price to what we're doing to Palestinians. And that's also related to the Israeli strategic investment in trying to silence any criticism of its policies, because they're making the connection between exposing human rights violations and potential end of impunity, which is what we're absolutely aiming for. But if I go back now to Sheikh Jarrah, then it's one of the, and again, we could come up with 100 different examples of how Israel's legal system is not only complicit, but in fact is providing the legitimacy to what is horrendous human rights violations against Palestinians. So the situation there is based on legislation passed by Israel in 1950 and in 1970. And I think it's worth mentioning that, because a lot of people also would like to pretend that this is all about Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the right-wing Likud and so on. No, this is a project advanced by Israeli governments, left, right, and center. And the legislation that enables the cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah from Palestinian families was passed during the days of what would have been considered moderate and even left-wing labor governments in Israel, as I said, 1950 and 1970. And the combination of those laws prevents Palestinians from reclaiming property that they owned pre-1948 in what has become a state of Israel, but makes it possible for Jews to do it on the other side of the Green Line. So there's plenty of Palestinian property in West Jerusalem, but they cannot claim even a single home based on that legislation. But that very same racist legislation makes that possible for Jews to go ahead and do that. By the way, not only in Sheikh Jarrah, also in Silwan, another neighborhood in East Jerusalem. And it's not, Palestinian families have no chance, no fighting chance in these circumstances because the laws are structured in that way. And we could also discuss home demolitions, and we could also discuss the whitewashing of killings of Palestinians, and we would come up with similar legal mechanisms that Israel does invest some time in, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, but eventually what it provides it, again, is both these legs, the ability to continue with this project and to claim that this is somehow legal. But it's not rule of law, it's rule by law.
And I guess where this leads us then is I have to be honest that at times I'm astonished by the relative equanimity of the Palestinian people. You know, there's this myth of they're violent, they're this, they're that. The more I understand about the daily outrages they experience, it seems to me impressive that they're not, reacting more strongly. Obviously there are incidents of violence. Obviously, every loss of life is tragic. But it seems to me this picture, this dehumanization that's taken place both in Israel and to a certain extent here in the United States has been integral to the project. That now we're seeing pictures of extreme violent mobs of Israelis attacking Palestinians and so on. But it seems to me that even on a more carrier wave sort of level, that there's a dehumanization, as I said, that takes place that makes this all, allows people to live with themselves and live with what they know about what's going on. Do you understand what I'm driving at, particularly in the context of Israeli society?
Yeah, I think that humiliation and dehumanization is one of the most horrific aspects of the reality here. And it's hard to stomach the fact that that is so. And I'm saying that as a Jewish citizen of this country that enjoys all the privileges that come with that. But I think trying to really see the lived experience and to try and really understand what that means, I think is essential and also very, very painful. And if I go back in that context, for instance, to the invisible violence, then often one of the things that I think about is this aspect of like, what do Palestinians know, right? So, for instance, the Israeli army has the ability. It's based on military law. There's nothing wrong in that from that perspective. It's totally unacceptable, but from like military orders, it's legit. Like almost any soldier can enter almost any Palestinian home at any point in time, including in 3 a.m. And soldiers do, repeatedly, everywhere in the occupied territories. And you could see some of those moments caught on video on the B'Tselem website and elsewhere. But you can just imagine, like, what does it mean for like a family to be woken and the dead of night with a bunch of armed soldiers stepping in? Like how terrifying that is, and the consequences of trauma that introduces, and so on. But what I want people to try and imagine is a night in which this isn't happening. But the parents know that it can happen, that the home isn't safe. You can always know that that's a possibility. How does it feel to try and grow a family with that knowledge all the time? Or for a mother to think that her son is participating in a demonstration, an anti-occupation demonstration. From Israel's perspective, all these demonstrations are illegal, including nonviolent ones. There is no right for freedom of speech, expression, from Israel's perspective, to Palestinians under occupation. That mother knows that if her son is, God forbid, shot and killed by Israeli security forces in that demonstration, then no one is going to be held accountable. All Palestinians know that by this point in time, based on decades of painful experience. Let that sink in, that knowledge. And listening to the colleagues from Gaza during the last week and a half, and listening to the bombs raining from the sky, and not knowing where the bomb is going to hit, and just trying to emotionally come to terms with those seconds until, if you're fortunate, your home shakes, and not worse than that, right? Like how terrible that fear, that constant fear is. But that is the reality that Palestinians have been facing and are facing. And I think especially if we think about recent weeks, then you see this reality in which Palestinians everywhere under Israel's control are under one form or another of state-sanctioned violence. It's happening inside Israel proper in what's called the mixed cities. It's happening in East Jerusalem, as we've already spoke about. It's happening all over the West Bank all the time, and it's happening in the Gaza Strip. And I think that what was a very powerful Palestinian response to this reality has been this unprecedented show of solidarity that these often called by like different fragments of the area between the river and the sea that have been fragmented for Palestinians as part of Israel's conquer and divide strategy, but to see these fragments coming together and standing together in solidarity.
Hagai, one of the aspects that hasn't really been discussed here in the States, to my knowledge, is 3 weeks ago, we were reading that Netanyahu was on the ropes politically. Now we're not reading that anymore. Now, he's standing up to Joe Biden. He's, there's no more discussion about his legal troubles or his, his political fate. Is any of this driven, you think, by internal Israeli politics?
Yeah, so I don't want to speculate about the motives of the prime minister, but I think it is important that people appreciate that beyond Netanyahu's specific challenges, political challenges recently related to the accusations surrounding his personal corruption, not to miss the bigger picture of where Israeli politics is, right? There is a solid right-wing majority in parliament, well above 50% of the members of parliament, that, regardless of Netanyahu, are all totally in acceptance of one form or another of the current reality, one form or another of perpetual Israeli control over the entire area between the river and the sea without giving millions of Palestinian subjects political rights, namely apartheid. And much of to the extent that it even exists, of the internal political debate amongst Jewish politicians is about the details of that subjugation. At what pace should we continue advancing this project? How much we can get away with without dealing with consequences, and so on. But also is a deep expression of dehumanization, because it's the class that is doing the oppressing is having an argument with itself about the details in which it's planning to continue oppressing the other half of the population. It's repugnant and it's not acceptable, but that's the reality that we live in, and it's not about Netanyahu in that sense. Okay. I want to say one more thing about you also mentioned Netanyahu's repeated conversations this week with President Biden. And I think it's important to also specifically address head-on U.S. Enabling and complicity and underwriting in this reality. There are other international stakeholders, absolutely, but the U.S. is unique in its responsibility, not just for the last week and a half, but for many of the recent decades. And I don't think anyone was disappointed with the Trump administration because no one had expectations. But let's talk about the Biden administration just for a minute.
Sure.
So I listened very attentively to the major foreign policy speech that was given in early March by Secretary of State Blinken. So allow me just to quote a short piece of that speech. "We will stand firm behind our commitments to human rights, democracy, the rule of law, because all human beings are equal in rights and dignity, no matter where they live or who they are," end quote. But this promise is yet to be fulfilled, because to date, US foreign policy on Israel-Palestine has spelled out the opposite, that not all human beings are equal, that Palestinian lives matter less, if at all, that the United States is standing firm not behind human rights, but behind Israel's violent system of oppression. Israeli impunity comes with a large Made in the USA label, but I'm sure that most Americans desire their country to follow a different path because they see the relationship between structural change at home and internationally. Their voices should be heard so that Palestinian lives will matter.
Thank you for that. And before I let you go, one more question if you have time, which is, it must be difficult and challenging. I know you're much more attuned to the suffering of the Palestinians, but it must be extremely challenging for you and your colleagues because I imagine you face a great deal of not just criticism, but hostility. And how are you holding up? Okay.
I appreciate the question. Thank you. Definitely, Israeli government incitement against effective human rights organizations is not something that's pleasant to deal with. But B'Tselem is a strong organization, and we have a strong team and a strong board. Having said that, it needs to be put in perspective, right? And what we're facing is nothing compared to what Palestinian human rights defenders are facing, is nothing compared to what my colleagues in Gaza are facing, together with the 2 million Palestinians located in the Strip are facing these days. And there's nothing compared to the campaigns Israel leads against Palestinian human rights defenders and the knowledge that their offices can be raided, that they can be arrested, that they can be shot, and so on. So with that in mind, I think that we should remember that Jewish Israelis are privileged and internationals are privileged. And I think, and we face so much less risks compared to what Palestinians are facing. And because of that, it's incumbent on us to take responsibility for ending this injustice.
Well, thank you for all the wonderful work you do. Again, we've been talking with Hagai El-Ad, who is Executive Director of B'Tselem in Jerusalem, a human rights organization. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for your dedication. And thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.